The water was cold. That was the first thing Sergeant James Brady noticed as it poured over the bow of the landing craft. Not the roar of shells, not the distant thunder of naval guns, but the cold. It seeped through his uniform, pooled in his boots, and reminded him that he was still alive, still breathing, still moving toward a beach he could not yet see. Around him, in the cramped steel hull of the LCA, 35 men stood shoulder to shoulder. Some prayed, some vomited. One young private, barely 19, kept checking and rechecking his rifle, hands trembling with each motion. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Somewhere ahead, through the grey morning fog, lay the coast of France. And beyond that fog, waiting in concrete bunkers and fortified positions, was an enemy that had spent 4 years preparing for exactly this moment. It was June 6, 1944. And the largest amphibious invasion in human history had begun. The men in that landing craft didn't know if they would live through the next hour. They didn't know if the boats beside them would make it to shore. They didn't know that on other beaches at that very moment, men were dying by the hundreds before they could even reach the sand. All they knew was forward, all they knew was the cold. What happened next would determine the fate of Western Europe. The stretch of coastline known as Normandy runs along the northern edge of France, facing the English Channel. In the spring of 1944, it represented something far more than geography. It was a wall, a barrier between two worlds, one under Nazi occupation, the other desperately clinging to freedom. For Adolf Hitler, the Atlantic coast was his fortress. Since 1940, German forces had constructed an elaborate system of defenses stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. Concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery emplacements, underwater obstacles designed to tear apart any vessel that approached. Mines buried in the sand. The Germans called it the Atlantic Wall, and they believed it was impenetrable. For the Allies, that wall had to fall. The Soviet Union had been bleeding for 3 years on the Eastern Front, demanding a second front to relieve the pressure. Britain had survived the Blitz but could not win the war alone. The United States had entered the conflict in 1941, and now, after years of planning, an invasion force of unprecedented scale had been assembled in England. The plan was called Operation Overlord. The man in command was American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The objective was simple to state and almost impossible to achieve: land over 150,000 men on 5 separate beaches in a single day, establish a foothold, and begin the liberation of Europe. The beaches had been given code names. The Americans would assault Omaha and Utah on the western flank. The British would land at Gold and Sword, and in the center, on a stretch of coast marked by seawalls, fortified houses and treacherous reefs, the Canadians would come ashore. Their beach was called Juno. It was, by any measure, one of the most heavily defended sections of the invasion zone. German planners had recognized its strategic value and positioned their forces accordingly. If Juno fell, the entire center of the Allied line could collapse before it began. And so, in the early morning darkness of June the 6th, thousands of young Canadian soldiers loaded into landing craft and headed toward a coastline most of them had never seen. They were not professional soldiers, most of them. They were farmers and factory workers, students and shopkeepers. They had come from places like Winnipeg and Regina, Halifax and Vancouver. They had crossed an ocean to fight in a war that had begun before some of them were old enough to understand it. Among them was a young corporal named Frederick Thompson, 23 years old, from a small town in Saskatchewan. He had enlisted in 1941, 3 weeks after his father told him it was his duty. His father had served in the previous war at Vimy Ridge and had never fully returned from it. Frederick carried a photograph of his younger sister in his breast pocket. She was 16. He had promised her he would come home. In another landing craft approaching the same beach from a different angle was Lieutenant David Chen, a medical officer attached to the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Chen was 27, the son of Chinese immigrants who had settled in Manitoba in the 1920s. He had faced discrimination his entire life, from schoolmates, from strangers, from a country that had once made it illegal for people like his parents to vote. And yet, when the war came, he had volunteered. He carried a medical kit that weighed almost as much as his rifle. He hoped he wouldn't need either. And then there was Private William Macwa, 19 years old, from the Peguis First Nation in Manitoba. He had grown up speaking Ojibwe before he learned English. He had never been on a boat larger than a canoe until the army put him on a transport ship. In the weeks before D-Day, during training exercises in England, other soldiers had asked him if he was scared. He had told them no, he had lied. In his pack, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small bundle of sage his grandmother had given him before he left. He had not told anyone about it. These three men did not know each other. They were scattered across different companies, different landing craft, different sectors of the assault wave. But in a few hours, their fates would converge on the same narrow strip of sand, beneath the same grey sky, facing the same enemy. The war would not remember most of them by name. History rarely does, but they were there. They were real. And what they did that morning mattered. The weather had nearly cancelled everything. In the days before June 6th, a storm system had moved across the English Channel, with winds that made any amphibious operation impossible. Eisenhower had already postponed the invasion once. His meteorologist told him the storm would break briefly on the morning of the 6th, a narrow window, perhaps 12 hours, before conditions deteriorated again. Eisenhower made the call. The invasion would proceed. But the brief clearing came with a cost. The seas remained rough, far rougher than the calm conditions the planners had hoped for. Landing craft designed for gentler waters pitched and rolled violently. Men who had eaten breakfast hours earlier now fought to keep it down. The motion was relentless, up and down, side to side, a sickening rhythm that made it impossible to think about anything else. Frederick Thompson gripped the side of his landing craft and stared at the back of the man in front of him. He could hear retching somewhere behind him, the sound almost lost beneath the drone of the engines. Salt spray coated his face. His hands were numb. The crossing from England had taken hours. They had loaded onto the landing craft in darkness, transferred from larger transport ships anchored miles offshore. The original plan called for the Canadians to hit the beach at the same time as the Americans on Omaha and Utah, first light, when the tide would be low enough to expose the German obstacles. But the rough seas slowed them down. The landing craft struggled against the current. Precious minutes slipped away, then half an hour, then more. By the time the Canadian assault waves approached Juno Beach, the tide had already begun to rise. This was not a minor inconvenience, it was a catastrophe in slow motion. The Germans had planted thousands of obstacles in the tidal zone, wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, concrete pyramids, many of them tipped with mines. At low tide, these obstacles would be exposed, visible, avoidable. At higher tide, they would be submerged just beneath the surface, invisible to the landing craft crews. The Canadians were heading straight toward them. Aboard the landing craft carrying the first wave, crews began to realize the danger. They could see the obstacles now, dark shapes just below the waterline, appearing and disappearing with each wave. There was no way to navigate through them safely. There was no way to stop. The first explosions came before the ramps dropped. A landing craft to Frederick Thompson's left struck a mine and disappeared in a column of white water. One moment it was there, carrying 36 men toward the shore. The next moment it was gone, replaced by debris and silence. Frederick did not see it happen. He heard it, a deep, percussive thump that he felt in his chest more than his ears. Then someone was shouting, and the engines were roaring, and the ramp at the front of his own craft was dropping with a mechanical clang. He was in the water before he understood what was happening. The cold hit him again, harder this time, and he was underwater, disoriented, his equipment dragging him down. His feet found the bottom, sand, not concrete, and he pushed himself upward, gasping, rifle held above his head. All around him, men were struggling through the surf. The water was chest-deep, then waist-deep, then knee-deep as they staggered toward the shore. Frederick could see the beach now, a narrow strip of sand backed by a low seawall. Beyond the seawall, houses. Beyond the houses, the shapes of German fortifications.
And then the machine guns opened up.
The sound was unlike anything Frederick had heard in training. It was not the controlled, rhythmic fire of an exercise. It was chaos. Overlapping bursts from multiple positions, bullets snapping past his ears, kicking up geysers in the water around him.
Men began to fall. Some dropped silently, disappearing beneath the waves. Others screamed, clutching wounds, trying to crawl forward through water that seemed to push back against them. An officer somewhere to Frederick's right was shouting orders that no one could hear.
Frederick ran. There was no thought, no strategy, only motion. His boots slipped on the sand, his lungs burned. A man beside him, he didn't know the man's name, had never spoken to him, suddenly stumbled and went down, and Frederick kept running because stopping meant dying. He reached the seawall and pressed himself against it, chest heaving, hands shaking. Other men were there too, a scattered cluster of soldiers who had made it through the surf, who had survived those first terrible minutes. They looked at each other with wild eyes, waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. Behind them, the beach was a scene of devastation. Landing craft burned at the waterline, bodies floated in the surf, equipment lay scattered across the sand, abandoned packs, dropped rifles, a single boot without an owner. And still more men were coming, more boats were approaching, more soldiers were about to step into the same nightmare. It was barely 7 o'clock in the morning. The battle for Juno Beach had only begun. The plan had been precise. Each company had specific objectives, specific timetables, specific routes inland. The tanks were supposed to arrive first, swimming in from amphibious landing craft, providing cover for the infantry. Engineers were supposed to clear the obstacles and mines before the main assault waves arrived. Artillery support was supposed to suppress the German positions.
None of it happened the way it was supposed to.
The amphibious tanks, modified Shermans fitted with canvas flotation screens, had been launched too far from shore. The rough seas swamped them almost immediately. Of the tanks assigned to support the Canadian assault on certain sectors, many sank before reaching the beach. Their crews drowned, trapped inside steel coffins at the bottom of the channel. The tanks that did make it ashore arrived late, after the infantry had already taken the worst of the initial fire. Engineers working to clear obstacles were cut down by machine gun fire before they could complete their work. Naval bombardment, intended to destroy the German bunkers, had largely missed its targets. The soldiers on Juno Beach were alone. David Chen, the medical officer, had made it to shore with his company, though he had lost his medical kit somewhere in the surf. He found it later, half buried in the sand, its contents soaked with seawater. Some of the bandages were still usable. Some of the morphine syringes were still intact. He began treating the wounded where they lay, in the open, without cover. He would later remember that day in fragments, disconnected images that returned to him for decades. A young soldier with a wound he could not treat, asking for water. The strange calm that settled over him when there was too much to do and too little time to do it. The face of a German prisoner barely older than the men he had been shooting at, eyes wide with fear. William Makwa, the young Ojibwe soldier from Manitoba, had become separated from his section during the landing. He found himself with a group of men he didn't know, following an officer he had never met, advancing toward a gap in the seawall where engineers had managed to blast an opening. The gap was barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Beyond it lay an open street bordered by damaged buildings. German fire was coming from multiple directions, from windows, from rooftops, from positions they couldn't see. William moved through the gap with the others, pressed against the wall of a building, rifle ready. He remembered his training: move fast, stay low, find cover. He remembered his grandmother's voice, speaking to him in a language the army had tried to make him forget. He survived that morning because a man beside him did not. A bullet, meant for William, struck the soldier on his left, and in the terrible mathematics of combat, that meant William lived long enough to reach the next piece of cover.
He never learned that soldier's name.
The fighting for the beach exits became the most desperate phase of the assault. German defenders had concentrated their positions where the seawall gave way to streets and pathways leading inland. These choke points became killing grounds, and the only way through was forward. Officers fell at alarming rates. The plan had called for coordinated advances, but coordination was impossible when radios didn't work and messengers didn't arrive. Small groups of men made decisions on their own, attacking positions without orders, improvising solutions to problems no one had anticipated. What saved the Canadian assault was not strategy, it was aggression. Soldiers who should have stayed in cover stood up and moved forward. Men who had every reason to wait for reinforcements attacked instead. The German defenders had expected the landing force to be pinned down, demoralized, easy to contain. They had not expected the Canadians to keep coming. By mid-morning, the first assault waves had broken through the beach defenses in several locations. The cost had been enormous, but the beachhead was forming. Inland, the situation was no less chaotic. Frederick Thompson found himself part of a mixed group of soldiers, men from different companies, different regiments, moving through a village whose name he didn't know. The streets were narrow, the buildings close together. Every window was a potential threat. As they advanced in bursts, crossing open spaces at a sprint, pressing against walls, checking corners. A German soldier appeared briefly in a doorway and disappeared before anyone could react. A burst of fire came from somewhere overhead, and they returned fire at windows they couldn't see into. Frederick lost track of time. Morning became afternoon without his noticing. His canteen was empty, his ammunition was running low, and he had not eaten since the night before. But they kept moving, clearing houses, pushing deeper inland. At some point they linked up with another Canadian unit that had landed further down the beach. An officer, a captain, Frederick thought, though he couldn't be sure, took command of the combined group and pointed toward a church steeple in the distance. "The objective is there," the captain said. "We take the crossroads, we hold it, and we wait for armor." No one asked what happened if the armor didn't come. By late afternoon, the Canadians had advanced further inland than any other Allied force on D-Day. The British at Golden Sword had fought through their beach defenses but were struggling to reach their objectives. The Americans at Omaha had faced a nightmare beyond anything the planners had imagined. Thousands of casualties, hours of fighting just to reach the seawall, entire companies nearly wiped out. But at Juneau, despite the chaos of the landing, despite the losses, despite the complete breakdown of the original plan, the advance continued. This was not triumph, it was survival. William Macqua was still alive when darkness began to fall. He had been fighting for more than 12 hours, had fired more rounds than he could count, had seen things he would never speak about. He was sitting against a stone wall on the outskirts of a village when the first signs of quiet began to settle over the landscape. The guns didn't stop, not entirely. Artillery still rumbled in the distance, and sporadic fire crackled from positions that hadn't yet been secured. But the intensity was fading. The immediate battle was ending. William looked at his hands. They were steady now, steadier than they had been that morning. He wondered if that meant something was wrong with him. A few yards away, a group of soldiers were digging in, preparing positions for the night. Someone had started a small fire to heat water for tea. A small act of normalcy in a landscape that had lost all meaning. William reached into his pack and found the bundle of sage still wrapped in oilcloth. He held it in his hands for a long moment, feeling its weight. Then he put it back, unopened.
Not yet, not until he was home.
David Chen worked through the night. Casualty clearing stations had been established behind the lines, and wounded men kept arriving, some walking, some carried, some barely conscious. The facilities were inadequate, the supplies insufficient, but they did what they could. He treated Canadians and Germans alike. The wounded were the wounded. A bullet wound didn't care about uniforms. Sometime after midnight, a young soldier was brought in with injuries Chen knew he couldn't treat. The soldier was conscious, aware of what was happening, and he asked Chen to write a letter for him to his mother back in Ontario. Chen wrote the letter by candlelight, taking down words the soldier could barely speak. It was short, unremarkable, full of things soldiers always said at the end. Chen folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He would mail it himself later when there was time. The soldier died before dawn. Frederick Thompson survived D-Day. He would fight through Normandy for the next 2 months, through hedgerow country that proved as difficult as the beaches, through towns whose names meant nothing to him until they meant everything. He was wounded in late July, a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder that earned him a trip to an aid station and eventually back to England. The photograph of his sister was still in his pocket when they loaded him onto a hospital ship. She was 17 now. He had kept his promise. The casualties on Juno Beach were severe but not catastrophic. Roughly 1,000 Canadians were killed or wounded on June 6th, a number that paled in comparison to the American losses at Omaha, but still represented a generation of young men who would not return home whole. The beaches were secured by nightfall. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The liberation of Europe had begun. But the men who had done the breaking did not feel liberated. They felt exhausted, hollowed out, fundamentally changed in ways they could not articulate. Some of them would carry the weight of that day for the rest of their lives. The Canadian advance on D-Day, further inland than any other Allied force, was attributed to a combination of factors: aggressive leadership at the small unit level, favorable timing in certain sectors, the particular determination of men who had been told that failure meant the end of everything. But such explanations reduce people to statistics. They miss the human cost, the individual moments of terror and courage that cannot be captured in official histories. What happened on Juno Beach was both remarkable and ordinary. Remarkable because it represented one of the pivotal moments of the 20th century, the beginning of the end of Nazi occupation in Western Europe. Ordinary because it was accomplished by ordinary people, farmers and students and shopkeepers who had been asked to do impossible things and had somehow done them. They were not heroes in any simple sense. They were men, frightened, cold, uncertain, who moved forward when everything told them to stop. William Macquer made it home to Manitoba in the spring of 1945. He married, had children, worked as a carpenter until his hands gave out. He never spoke about the war to his family, not in detail. When his grandson asked him decades later what it had been like, William thought for a long time before answering.
"Cold," he said finally. "The water was cold."
He never explained what he meant, and his grandson never asked again. David Chen returned to medicine after the war. He became a surgeon in Winnipeg, raised 3 children, lived long enough to see a country that had once excluded people like him finally begin to reckon with its history. He kept the letter he had written for that dying soldier in his desk drawer until the day he died. His children found it when they cleaned out his office. They mailed it to the soldier's family 60 years late. The family wrote back, They had always wondered what had happened, how their brother, their uncle, their great-uncle had spent his final hours. Knowing, even decades later, brought something like peace. Frederick Thompson's sister outlived him. She had the photograph he carried returned to her after his death, not from the war but from old age in 1991. On the back of the photograph in faded pencil was a note Frederick had written during the crossing from England to France. It said, "I'm coming back, don't worry." She kept that photograph on her mantelpiece until she joined him. In the official records, D-Day is remembered as a victory, and it was a decisive turning point that made the defeat of Nazi Germany inevitable. But for the men who lived through it, the word victory felt inadequate. There had been too much loss, too much fear, too many friends who didn't make it past the waterline. The beaches have been quiet for 80 years now. The bunkers are empty, the obstacles have been cleared. Tourists walk the sand where men once died, taking photographs of monuments they don't entirely understand. But if you stand on Juno Beach at dawn, when the light is grey and the water is still, you can almost hear them. The drone of engines, the splash of landing craft, the shouts of men moving forward into uncertainty. They were there, they were real, and they changed everything. A Canadian War Graves Commission report filed in 1947 and forgotten for decades in an archive in Ottawa contains a single handwritten note at the bottom of the final page. The author is unknown. The context has been lost. It reads, "We did what we could. May it have been enough." The tide comes in, the tide goes out, the sand remembers nothing and everything.